What is the best sort of life for a human being? Socrates claimed in 400 BC that a man lives a happier life if he's just, even if he's thrown starving into prison for the rest of his life, than if he's unjust and he's celebrated and honored all of his days and is never caught for his crimes. Could that possibly be correct? If not, why not? And what difference should the question make to us now? What moves the human heart? Shakespeare's characters throw us into the depths of lust, envy, greed, pride, ambition. What do those characters have to say about the way that we act, or that we behave, or that we believe? And if so, what difference would it make to read about them in Shakespeare? And why Shakespeare, whose Elizabethan English is very difficult for us who speak modern English to understand. Thomas Hobbes wrote in 1651 a book called Leviathan, one of the 2 or 3 most influential works in the history of thinking about government and politics in Western society. He was writing from the midst of a raging civil war, and he argued that unless we gave all the power, unless we surrendered all ultimate control to a legitimate king, that we would all rob and kill each other. Was he right about that? Is that the way things actually work? And is the question relevant to us today when we no longer believe in kings? Hello, my name is Jeff Brenzel, and I'm the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions at Yale University. I lecture from time to time in the philosophy department at Yale, and my work in philosophy centers around ethics and also the history of the ideas that we've had about something we like to call human nature. Speaking of human nature, one of my personal heroes, Aristotle, claimed that by nature, everyone seeks to know, everyone desires to know. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume that you are already an intellectually curious person, and that you're not only chasing after knowledge as hard as you can, you're also trying to build up the skill sets and acquire the kind of capacities and abilities that you're going to need to become a better learner overall. If these things are in fact true about you, then here's my advice in a nutshell. Make a choice in college to read some old books, even a substantial number of old books. My argument will be that reading the right old books in the right way is better than reading only new books, much less using only new ways of learning that have nothing to do with books at all. But let's be careful about what I'm claiming and what I'm not claiming. I'm not claiming that you should read only old books, or that old books are better because they're old, or that you should never read any new books, or that new books are worthless. Only that you should read and learn how to read some old books. But which ones would those be? How do you learn how to read them in the right way? Why should you read them in college? And how could doing that change your life for the better? How is that going to make you smarter? And moreover, how's it going to make you wiser? The dialogues of Socrates, Aristotle's Ethics, Oedipus Rex, The City of God, Leviathan, Dante's Inferno, King Lear, Paradise Lost, War and Peace. There are a lot of these books. But why spend a significant amount of your time on books that by definition are outdated? Why not go after the books that bring everything up to date? Don't we know everything those people already knew and much, much more? So a little personal background here. I went off to university in 1971. No one in my family had ever graduated from college, much less a place like Yale. I'd never visited across the state line. I never had even been on an airplane before the one that swept me off to New Haven, Connecticut. Now, when I actually showed up at Yale, I applied in total ignorance and almost by accident to a special freshman year program called Directed Studies. So what is Directed Studies? In Directed Studies, you take 3 full-year courses in the history of Western thought, in philosophy, in literature, and in politics. You start with what the classic Greeks had to say, and then you roll forward with the centuries until you end up about a century behind where we are right now. There's no textbooks, there's no summaries, there's no cliff notes. You read only the original works. And it was both the single most difficult and the single most transforming educational experience that I've ever had. About 15 years ago, I came back to Yale after founding companies, managing organizations, and after earning a PhD in philosophy. And I'm having the opportunity there today to teach in this very same program that I took over 30 years ago. So I've gotten to know these classic works fairly well. I've become familiar with them. I've seen their effects on students. And I've had the chance to stack them up against my own life experience and stuff that I've read from lots of modern books. So here I am, ready to give you some good reasons to look into the classics yourself. Now, the first thing to point out is something that I think you already know. There are a lot of books out there, and you don't have much time. The Library of Congress has over 20 million volumes. That's the largest library in the world. That's not counting the journals, the publications. It's not counting the internet. It's not counting the blogs. It's not counting Wikipedia. It's not counting the entire Googleplex. Meanwhile, down here on the personal level, I'm 58 years old. I've been a pretty strong reader for about 40 years. Back home, I've got a personal library of about 2,000 books, volumes. And if you do the math, that's about 50 books times 40 years, about 50 books a year. It's about a book a week. I hope you can see the problem. My problem, which is also your problem, which is we ain't going to make it through the Library of Congress. Not only that, we're not going to get to 99.999% of everything that's ever been written. You know, Mahatma Gandhi said, "Live as though you'll die tomorrow, but learn as though you'll live forever." Gandhi was as aware as you and I are that we're not going to live forever. And of course, that means that you are going to have to be extremely picky about what you choose to read, even if you live according to Gandhi. You literally have no other choice. But now it seems I've only made my job harder because I've got to persuade you that with this precious time that you have for learning and study, which is dwindling all the time, that you're going to take some of it and devote it to things that are outdated. So let's focus on the principle of necessity. And that means the principle of having to make these difficult and time-consuming choices. I'd like to give you 5 reasons, 5 rough and ready criteria for identifying a classic of literature or philosophy or politics. Now, no 1 or 2 of these criteria are going to be decisive, but I think if you put them all together, they're going to prove actually to be quite useful. First, the work addresses a permanent, universal concern about the human condition. From the philosophical perspective, it has something to say about the way we should live. From a literary perspective, it helps us imagine different ways that we could live. And from a political perspective or an historical perspective, it helps us remember ways that we have lived. So that's mark number one of a classic. Mark number two is that the work has been a game changer. It changed perspective or shifted perspective on those issues, both for the earliest people who read the book and also for those who came later. Mark number three is that the work has stimulated or provoked or responded to many other important works. Mark number four is that many generations of the very best readers and the most expert critics have rated the work highly as one of the best and most important of its kind, even if those reviewers, those experts, didn't agree on anything else, and even if they took or had a violent argument with the work itself. Mark number five is that the work usually does require a strenuous effort to both engage it and understand it, but rewards that great effort in multiple ways and very highly. Before we think about what these criteria rule in, let's think about what they rule out. Let's say that you run up to me with a novel that you picked up just last week. You wave it in the air and you say, "Professor Brenzel, I've got a great book here for you. It's an instant classic, even better than Moby Dick, maybe even better than Moby Dick." What am I likely to respond? Well, it may be in fact very good. And your recommendation may persuade me to read it, particularly if I have a high opinion of you as an expert reader. Your new favorite book may in fact become a classic someday. But it hasn't changed the game as yet for other writers and readers. It hasn't provoked or influenced lots of other works. How could it? You don't know how experts and other readers are going to evaluate it over time. You're not even sure how you're going to see the book over time. But let's remember the critical problem that we all have. Way too many books and not nearly enough time. So where are you likely to get the biggest bang for your reading dollar and for your reading hour? Something published last week or something that stood the centuries of tests by tough readers and that has in fact spawned a great deal of what you'll be reading today? So I'm sort of defining a classic as an old book. It's been through generations of readers, big game-changing ideas, and something that you can expect to find to be a considerable challenge to tackle. So let's flesh it out with just a few examples before we talk about what good it's going to do you to read such a book in a college course. Socrates was a philosopher who lived in Athens, ancient Greece, about 400 years before the birth of Christ. You've probably heard his name, even if you know nothing else about him. You may also know that the other citizens of Athens put him to death because he went around asking a lot of challenging questions, needling people, irritating them with questions about their actions and their beliefs that they didn't care to answer. Well, it's a remarkable fact that for the past 24 centuries, very few thinkers in the Western tradition have been able to avoid having to come at some point to grips with Socrates and his life and his death. It's even more interesting that Socrates, so far as we know, never actually wrote down a single word. He strolled around the town, embarrassing prominent people with his questions. He liked to say that the only superiority that he ever claimed was that he was absolutely certain that he was ignorant, but he found that people believed that they knew all kinds of things, and in that, he was superior to them. Now, one of the young aristocrats who got a big charge out of following Socrates around the town was a young wrestler named Plato, maybe the first scholar-athlete. So Plato wrote a series of dialogues after Socrates died that featured his hero in the principal role. The early dialogues do seem to reflect for us this business of walking around asking these difficult questions that no one can answer. Later, in the later dialogues, Plato begins to use Socrates as a mouthpiece or as someone who represents the kinds of new questions that Plato himself began to ask under Socrates' inspiration. To give you some indication of how expert readers over time have understood Plato's thought and its central importance in the tradition, the great 20th century philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead once said that all of Western thought is nothing more than a series of footnotes to Plato. Quite a claim. And remember that it was Plato's encounter with Socrates that inspired all of Plato's thought. Now, Plato's single most important dialogue, with Socrates as the hero, is a dialogue called The Republic. And in it, Plato tries to formulate two basic, fundamental, and universal questions. What's the best sort of life for a human being? And beyond that, what's the best society for producing the conditions under which human beings could live that kind of life? These two questions give the book the first mark of greatness that I was discussing, which is the Republic addresses permanent and universal questions, ones that might puzzle you as much as they did Socrates and Plato. The book opens with a really terrific argument about justice, whether it's the just or the unjust person who gets the better of it in life. Socrates confronts a very sarcastic and very aggressive young man named Thrasymachus, who attacks the common notion that justice is a virtue. Listen then, says Thrasymachus, I proclaim that might is right, and that justice, as you call it, is whatever happens to be in the interest of the stronger. There are different forms of government, but they all make laws according to their own interests. Everywhere there is only one principle of so-called justice, which is that justice turns out to be whatever happens to be in the interest of the stronger. So, have you ever heard someone make this argument before? That might makes right? That justice has no fixed meaning? That what is considered just in a society is just whatever the people running the society say it is? I'd be surprised if you hadn't, because it's a universally recurring argument, not only throughout the dorms of any good colleges down through time, but also down through the centuries in the debates of the very best philosophers. Now, I can't do justice in this short talk to even this relatively simple opening framing argument of the Republic between Thrasymachus and Socrates. But essentially, Socrates tries to answer Thrasymachus by pointing out that we distinguish between good rulers and bad rulers, just like we distinguish between good shepherds and bad shepherds, or good boat captains and bad boat captains. The good shepherds act in the best interests of the sheep, and the good boat captains act in the best interests of their boats and passengers. So a ruler, if he's rightly named a ruler, or she's rightly named a ruler, is someone who acts in the best interest of the subjects, and the bad ones don't. Thrasymachus calls this drivel. He points out that the shepherd hardly cares for the sheep. He's simply fattening them for the slaughter. Consider further, most foolish Socrates, he says, that the just is always a loser in comparison with the unjust. First of all, in private matters, wherever the unjust is the partner of the just, you will find that the unjust man always gains more and the just man always gets less. Next, in their dealings with the government, when there is an income tax, the just man will pay more and the unjust man less on the same amount of income. And when there is anything to be received, the one gains nothing, the other gains much. By this standard, Thrasymachus goes on to say, the best life is actually the one to be had by the absolute tyrant, who can take anything that he wishes by force and make everyone else pay honor and obedience. So not only is being a tyrant the best kind of life, all people would become tyrants if only they could. Now Socrates at this point knocks Thrasymachus down with some verbal and logical tricks that I'm not going to take you through in this talk. And outwitted, Thrasymachus stalks off from the conversation, not to return. The young friends of Socrates are not satisfied with this outcome, and they take up the core question, but in a much harder form. They ask Socrates to prove to them that the just person is always happier and always has a better life than the unjust person, no matter how poor, deprived, disgraced, or reviled the just man might be, and no matter how wealthy, honored, and completely unharmed an unjust man might be. So the rest of the Republic is Plato's attempt to answer this question along with a number of other questions. In the course of it, he draws a surprisingly compelling picture of human psychology. He speculates on the nature of knowledge. He presents a proposal for the ideal state, and he polishes it all off with a theory about enlightenment and about the ultimate nature of reality. Along the way, he speculates about the relations between men and women, how to raise and educate children to be good citizens, and the right way for human beings to investigate questions of all kinds. Now, Plato himself had a brilliant student named Aristotle, who, for my money, actually surpassed Plato in a number of different ways, but was certainly heavily influenced by Plato. So let me just give you a very quick notion of how things play out in the history of thought for Plato's and Aristotle's thinking, and in fact, for your own. First, their thinking stays very much alive in Greece and Rome for 400 years until the coming of Christ, and beyond that for many centuries more. If you happen to be a Christian, what you think of as Christianity, the very concepts and ideas that form the basis for Christianity, actually turn out to owe a great deal to Plato and Aristotle. Virtually everything that Christianity teaches about God, about human nature, about human fulfillment, arises from what the historians of religion like to call the marriage of Jerusalem and Athens. That is, the marriage of Greek and Jewish thinking. One big moment for this process comes about 8 centuries after Plato and Aristotle, 4 centuries after Christ, when a man named St. Augustine writes a truly monumental work in the history of Western thought, a real classic, The City of God. He writes this book just as the Roman Empire is collapsing around his ears from invasions of barbarians. Augustine was very influenced by Platonic thinking, even though he wasn't all that familiar directly with Plato's works. And he sets the course of Christian thinking for a very long time. In fact, if you're knowledgeable about the history of Christian doctrine or Christian theology, you'll know that Augustine is influential right up to the current moment. Then another 800 years after St. Augustine, a priest around the year 1250 named Thomas Aquinas rediscovers many of the lost works of Aristotle. To put this very briefly, he puts together the thought of Aristotle with the thought of Augustine, comes up with a new synthesis for Christian thinking, and it turns out to be a game changer. The result is, for the most part, what the Roman Catholic Church teaches to this very day. St. Thomas Aquinas is the primary Orthodox theologian of Catholicism. Meanwhile, the Italian poet Dante, who lives 1 generation after Aquinas, reads Aquinas, is influenced by his work, and as one of the 3 or 4 greatest poets ever to live, presents us with his own view of human nature, fulfillment, and human destiny when he writes his 3 epic poems about hell, purgatory, and heaven. You've probably heard of Dante's Inferno. So now fast forward another 250 years, and we come to about the year 1500, Martin Luther in Germany. Now, Luther gets very angry about a lot of things that are happening in the Catholic Church. He goes back and rips Aquinas apart. He trashes Aristotle, and he returns for his inspiration to the game-changing works of St. Augustine and St. Paul. By doing this, Luther also starts a process that splinters Christianity into a million pieces. Game changers. Another 100 or so years after Luther, we have John Milton. Milton is an English poet. He takes his inspiration from the reforming of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation, and he writes the greatest epic poem in the English language, Paradise Lost. It gives his own picture, the Protestant picture, of human nature, human history, human destiny, God's will. So if you happen to be a Catholic and you believe that the Catholic Church teaches the same thing always and everywhere and has from the very beginning, or if you're an evangelical Protestant and you believe that all of your own views come directly from a plain, straightforward reading of New Testament texts, in either case, you could not be more mistaken. The very teachings of the Catholic Church, or the very ways that a Protestant Christian interprets the words of the Bible and Scripture, results from speculations and collisions taking place among ideas that involve Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, St. Paul, Dante, Martin Luther, and Milton. Here's a very small example of something quite specific. Many Christians believe that Satan, the devil, was once a great archangel, in fact, that he was the highest of all the angels, and that his name was Lucifer, and that he rebelled against God in heaven before the creation of the entire world. Later, he successfully tempted our first parents, Adam and Eve, to eat an apple in the Garden of Eden. There is actually remarkably little in the Hebrew Scriptures about Satan, and what's there does not happen to include these beliefs. Satan, as we imagine him, is actually a much later invention, and he's not thought of as either a fallen angel or even fully identified with the serpent in the garden who tempted Adam and Eve to taste the fruit until 4 centuries after the life of Christ. Augustine has a lot to do with who Satan becomes. And the picture that you yourself may have in your mind of a rebel angel, a war in heaven between the good angels and the bad angels, well, that's something that John Milton imagined for us when he published Paradise Lost in 1667. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle exert influences in many other threads or conversations or discussions that are taking place in the Western history of ideas. For instance, the encounter with Socrates enters very strongly into Søren Kierkegaard's work in the 19th century. Kierkegaard's the godfather of existentialism. Ultimately, Kierkegaard produces all these other philosophers like Heidegger and Sartre. Socrates also provoked and gave shape in an encounter, a philosophical encounter, gave shape to Friedrich Nietzsche's thought, also in the 19th century, as Nietzsche actually seeks to try to undo what he considers to be the disaster that Socrates has bequeathed to Western civilization. So you simply cannot study the history of Western thought without running into Plato and Socrates just around about every corner. You can't read a thinker who hasn't been influenced himself or herself by these ideas in some way, as well as the way that they actually pose the original questions. What's the best sort of life for a human being? And what's the best kind of society in which that sort of life can be lived? So the Republic is still what I would call a living book. It still fuels encounters. It still provokes us, provokes students in my classroom, I think just as much as Socrates provoked them in the streets of ancient Greece. It has something to teach us. It has something to connect us very deeply to the ideas of many others. It's something that's made our society, in some very deep respects, what it is. You might say that Plato and his inspiration, Socrates, are the opposite of outdated thinkers. On this rather quick dash through the centuries, I've not forgotten the question that I'm supposed to answer, which is, so what? Why does it do you any good to know these things? What's all this about strenuous effort? And what's that got to do with something being a classic? Aren't there any classics that are easy to read? Or to cut to the chase, and regarding all of this strenuous effort, why do I really have to dig into Plato's Republic at all? Why can't I just hear about it from you? Or why can't I read the Cliff Notes version? Or why can't I find a summary or a digest or look on my neighbor's notes? Why won't Wikipedia tell me everything that is truly important for me to take away from the book? Why can't I take advantage of the fact that all these other people have read it, commented on it, and used it for some purpose or another? What's the takeaway? Well, the 20th century philosopher and critic Mortimer Adler put it this way: the path of true learning is strewn with rocks, not roses. But I am still saying, he goes on, that the great books can be read by every person. In one sense, of course, they are the most difficult to read, but they are in another sense the most readable, both for the less and the more competent reader, because they are the most instructive. What Adler is trying to tell us here is that just because something is difficult doesn't mean that the time you spend with it is not worthwhile. And in fact, that any amount of time that you spend with one of these kinds of works will actually be more valuable to you than the same amount of time that you spend on a work of lesser quality. But what Adler wants us to understand is the principle of no pain, no gain. And in fact, that in the case of works of the mind, that whatever the pain you experience, whatever time and study that you're going to give to these works pay a greater return. You might say they have a higher interest rate than the ordinary stocks and bonds that you're going to be exposed to in the rest of your courses. So what I'm going to do now is to try to give you 5 takeaways. That is, 5 valuable things that are specific to you that you can pull out of these books and take away with you to the other things that you're studying and also to your own life. Number 1, the value of forgotten ideas. Some old ideas are not actually outdated. The entire period that we call the European Renaissance actually consisted of people rediscovering a bunch of ideas from the ancient world and giving them a new application. So, point number 1 is, some of these old ideas are actually valuable. Number 2, the value of making connections between ideas. There is less new under the sun than what you might think, and seeing the connections that tie one thinker to another in a tradition also gives you a measure of how far we've come on some problems, and what problems seem to have heavily resisted the attempts of human beings to give them answers. The one that we've been considering from time to time through the course of this talk is one of those. What's the best sort of life for a human being? This is a question that you'll be asking yourself as you try to figure out things like, where am I going to get a job? Where am I going to live? Who am I going to marry? How am I going to raise my children? These are questions that are permanent aspects of the human condition. You're also going to discover that this is not the kind of question in which science has suddenly delivered a fantastic new answer. People have been asking and answering this question for a long time, and looking at some old thinkers can help you see the connections between the ways people originally asked these questions and the way we do, but also give you a perspective on what's been solved, which in some of these cases is very little, and what remains for you to consider and actually determine by the way that you live your own life. The third thing is that great books of the past are going to engage you with a number of great minds who don't share any of your assumptions, just as we were talking about with Plato. It's a different culture, a different morality, a different religion, a different politics. Call this the value of strangeness, which is not only an additional perspective on what you believe, but I'm going to claim is also a primary source of human creativity. The fourth value is, quite frankly, the value of building up your intellectual muscle power. You don't get to be a better wrestler by wrestling all the little kids in your neighborhood and beating them up and sending them home crying. If you're going to be a better wrestler, you're going to have to get your own nose bloody by going up against people who are bigger and stronger and better than you are. So finally, 5, there is the value of forming better judgments. Once you've encountered with the best of all time and wrestled them to the ground, you're going to be much better positioned to make your own good, discerning judgments about where to spend your precious time, without having past generations of experts to do the reading, you might say, ahead of you and post the signs, without knowing how a book is going to influence other books, and without yourself being able to figure what the views are going to be of this book in the future. You will be able to tell junk from gold, trash from something that's worthwhile. Why? Because you'll know when you're actually up against a real mind. You will have experienced the best that we know. So let's dig down a little bit into the value of some old and outdated ideas. A man named Malthus in 1798 published a classic work in political economy. It's called An Essay in the Principle of Population. Now, the basic idea is that populations can only grow up to the point where they necessarily collapse because of limited resources, famine, and disease. But the essay explores the ideas in a lot of very interesting ways, and actually it was a major influence on Charles Darwin in the development of the theory of evolution. Despite the game-changing nature of this work, economists and scientists of the industrial age have generally held that Malthus was wrong. Why? Because he predicted we were all going to die back in the 18th century. He thought that we were going to outrun the food sources with our population and that nothing could stop a headlong rush over the cliff. What he did not take into proper account were the game-changing aspects of human ingenuity and creativity that would find a way around resource bottlenecks. Now, during the oil shocks of the 1970s, and if you go back and look for this, you'll see that the ideas of Malthus came very much back into view. Why? Because people were seeing resources begin to run out. The world's population had doubled over a period of about 30 to 60 years, and it was going to be set to double again. So Thomas Malthus and his ideas about what happens when you increase the population past the carrying load came around for more currency. Today, if you Google the name Malthus, you're going to get over 3 million hits on the internet. His fundamental ideas are once again at the center of debates about peak oil, environmental damage, global population, the prospects for global catastrophe. Malthusian ideas are everywhere, and his work is being invoked as people wonder if the world is about to prove Malthus right in the end. Here's another example of old ideas being mined for new insights. In ancient Greece, Aristotle wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics, or for short, the Ethics. It's actually a book about human happiness and about what it takes to be a happy person. Now, we don't ordinarily associate the idea of ethics with a work on happiness. We think about ethics as being things like moral obligations, duties, what we're called upon to perform despite our desires to do other things. Aristotle had a different perspective on this. He was an original proponent of the idea, and you may have heard this idea, that virtue is its own reward. That in fact, the things that make you an excellent parent, the things that make you an excellent citizen, are also the things, if pursued consciously and done well, make you a happy human being. In other words, that there's a dedication to excellence, where excellence consists of the virtues that are required for us to live well and do well with one another, that is the foundation for human beings to be happy. This goes these days by the name virtue ethics. And philosophers and psychologists all over the world are studying what makes for human happiness. Aristotle actually has something extremely contemporary to contribute to that debate. So again, reading these works gives you a very different sense of what progress consists of in one whole area of human thought, and what even our notion of progress might mean when we start to talk about something like human happiness. Are there really new messages coming from the cosmos about what it takes to be happy? My third value or takeaway involved what I call the value of strangeness. Now, this one's a little harder to explain, so let me use an analogy. You've probably traveled. People like to travel. Some people travel a great deal. What do people feel like they learn from traveling, particularly travel to another society? One of the things that good travelers, people who have done this well and spent enough time in a foreign society to really learn something about it, they generally say that they're struck by the ways that that society is different from our own, and they're struck by the different kinds of answers that people give to questions that we suddenly discover we've made a lot of assumptions about. That is, we've made an assumption about our lifestyle, or an assumption about what people want out of life, or an assumption about how people are going to get those things that actually isn't operating in this other society at all. And of course, it might make us stop and think, is our way of doing this actually the best way of doing it? Might I pick up some ideas from this other place? Well, great books can have some of this same effect through the value of strangeness. Let's consider two women writers for a moment. And if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed that I haven't talked about any women thinkers or writers up to this point. And in that regard, it's important to remember that until very recent times, very few women had access to the kinds of educations or were given the kind of encouragement to engage in this kind of thinking or this kind of work or this kind of reading as they are today. So you might say it's only very recently that women have entered this long conversation. Why? Because they were excluded from it. But Jane Austen was a brilliant novelist, and what Jane Austen wrote about were the manners and the ways of life and the marriage and family arrangements of English country gentry of the late 1700s. Now, it's very unlikely that you're going to have much knowledge about the ways of life that were current among the English gentry in the late 1700s. And that is just what makes encountering them valuable and what makes encountering Jane Austen herself valuable. For she knows this world and these people inside and out. And she's an exceptional, clever, and devastating observer of the human heart. You come to know both the world that these people occupied and the ways in which they occupied this world in a way that no other author is ever going to reveal. Or take another example, Emily Dickinson. Now, Emily Dickinson was one of the 2 or 3 master poets that the United States has produced. She had an even more narrow and an even stranger world to show us, consisting primarily of the workings of her own mind and her emotions, which were exceptionally focused and intense. It was Dickinson, a virtual recluse, who said, "Parting is all we know of heaven and is all we need of hell." She also said, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted." And also this, "An ear can break a human heart as quickly as a spear. We wish the ear had not a heart, so dangerously near. Reading Emily Dickinson will introduce you to a mind and a heart that simply does not work like yours. It doesn't work like mine, but she knows yours, and she knows her own as well. Thoughts, like Dickinson's and like Austen's, can dislodge us from the everyday world, the things that we're familiar with, and the ways that we tend to find it natural to think. But isn't that the value of an education? And isn't one of the most practical things that the world is seeking, the world of business, the world of law, the world of government, the world of the arts, even the world of academia, aren't they seeking for people who take up new and strange and different and creative perspectives? In other words, isn't this takeaway from these great and classic works maybe among the most practical things that they have to offer us? My fourth value involved building your muscles and your reading skills and the ways that you're going to tackle increasingly difficult material. Now, I don't think this one requires illustration so much as it does a reminder. As we said, you don't get to the Olympics by training with weaklings. And these works have survived in part because they've been written by geniuses. That is, we know that these are minds worth wrestling with because so many have. The good news is that does not mean that you have to be a genius to understand them. Thank God, or I wouldn't have made it very far myself. You have heard the saying, she got to where she is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So here are the giants. Master the skills that it takes to get up on their shoulders, and you're going to see quite a distance. You'll see more than they saw. You'll also be prepared, better prepared, to grapple with lesser works that don't stand as tall. So for the fifth value, I said that to the extent that you encounter and engage classic works successfully, you'd be a better judge of modern works. And my example here has to be Shakespeare. Now, many of the greatest critics and readers of world literature, including across cultures and across boundaries, have had the same basic view of Shakespeare, and that is, whatever his flaws, whatever the weaknesses, and whatever the strengths of other writers, no literary giant has ever written more profoundly or more inventively or more imaginatively about the human condition than Shakespeare. Harold Bloom, the great literary critic where I work and teach here at Yale, called one of his books on Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. And he meant by this that Shakespeare, with these characters like Falstaff and Hamlet and King Lear, quite literally created, around the year 1600, our modern sense of what it means to be a human being acting and thinking in the world. Many of his hundreds of memorable characters, men and women, either vividly or unexpectedly respond to their life situations in ways that we couldn't predict or typecast, or they open up new perspectives on what truly motivates each of us. So once you have successfully engaged Shakespeare in his comedies and in his tragedies, you're going to very quickly sense in other writers whether or not they're capable of doing the same thing. And if they are, you're going to be drawn on to read them. And if they're not, you can safely set them aside because you've got a better standard against which to make your choices. Let's say that you're persuaded of these 5 valuable things that I say you can take away from these work if you include some of them on your course schedule in college. Could your life be better, personally, if you invited some of these authors into it? And how so? So think about it like this. I shared an experience a number of years ago when my son got involved, and I got involved as well, in the Boy Scouts. We hiked, we camped, we made friends. We had lots of families in the troop, lots of other adults on the trips. It was all fine. It was wonderful. But then we came to a point in the development of these young men and their skills where we were prepared to introduce them to something more adventurous. And we planned a 2-week wilderness expedition, something that we hadn't come close to doing with these young men before. I was very excited. It was something that I had done, and I wanted my son to have the same experience as I had had. So let me get this straight, he said. We'll have to carry twice the weight on our backs that we ever have before, including the food. The food's going to be pretty bad. We're going to have to purify every single drop of water we drink. We'll have to figure out our own trail. It's going to be in rugged mountains. We'll probably spend some time getting lost. What exactly am I going to get out of this that I can't get from the hiking and camping that we've already done, which I've liked perfectly fine, and which we did without all this pain and hassle? Smart boy, good questions. So I finally said, I don't think I can really tell you what you're going to get out of this. You have to experience it for yourself, and then you'll know. So I guess I'm just asking you to trust me on this. So my son Paul certainly had some skeptical company among the other scouts in the troop. And sure enough, a few days into this expedition, things began to deteriorate. We had some lousy weather, there's blisters, people were hungry, the boys are ragging on each other, no one's really getting along, and my son is looking at me with those all-knowing eyes of a 16-year-old. But then the boys started to toughen up, the weather cleared, we got higher up in the mountains. They started to rely on each other more. They figured out how to break camp efficiently. And so one day we get to a really terrific climb during which there was a fair amount of complaining. It was a brutal effort. And when we emerged from the tree line, we're on top of the highest peak in the region. We were exhilarated. The boys were exhilarated. And my son came over to me and he said, "Hey, Dad." I said, "What?" He said, "This is fantastic." I said, "I know." And he said, "I just want you to know I get it." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "This is by far the most fantastic thing that we've ever done together." So what had we learned by virtue of taking a much more arduous, a much more difficult journey than we had taken up to that point in our scouting experience? Well, he's now got an experience of the outdoors that's given him a permanent interest that he can pursue in life. And of course, there was also the element of the experience that revolved around the connection that he and I made together by virtue of having the experience together. So remember what Adler said. In one sense, of course, the great books are the most difficult to read, but they are, in another sense, the most readable, both for the less and the more competent, because they are the most instructive. And that's the key word. Obviously, I do not mean, says Adler, most readable in the sense of with the least effort, even for the expert. I mean that these books reward every degree of effort and ability to the maximum. So here's something else to think about, and it's something that Adler has to say, and it goes beyond the 5 takeaways that I gave you for things of value that you can derive from these books. You're going to encounter a lot of things in your life that you need to know and things that you need to learn about that aren't going to change you much at all. You've learned many of these things already. You learned how to drive a car, but that didn't change who you were as a human being. I'm suggesting to you now that you're going to be in the same position with relation to these works we've been talking about in this lecture as the scout who's done the weekend hiking, taken the day trip, maybe cooked breakfast at the camporee, and so forth. Remember how I said at the beginning that Aristotle said it's our nature to want to know things. Well, just as it's our nature to work, to play, to find a mate, to live in society, remember how I said that wisdom is something different from knowledge. Well, here's my final thought for you, and it's a deep paradox of learning. You don't necessarily know what you are looking for until you find it. And it's the effort of finding it that actually turns you into a different person than the one who set out on the journey to begin with. And that's why reading these great works is very similar, in fact, to the experience that my son had of a wilderness expedition after never having attempted anything more than what you can get on the low-lying ground. So when you finally do achieve a radical new perspective, when it's not just a matter of taking in bits of information and knowledge, but it's a matter of changing how you put them together, and also it's a matter of changing who you are as a result, you will see a different value in these things, and for instance, these books, and you're also going to see yourself in a new light. So I give you the only answer that I really can, the best answer I know. Why read these books? It's the same answer I gave my son. You climb up into the mountains, you make your most strenuous effort, you give it everything you have, and what's your reward? It's the view. It's the view. Thank you very much.